to bring into the working group, and I really look forward to and invite all delegations to bring their ideas to the working group and their perspectives to the table. Next slide, please. So let's look a little bit on the context. One more, please. When we, thanks to Jean-François, we already know quite well what Article 11 requires, and you are all aware that there are other obligations to exchange information or to notify under United Nations space law. In particular, there's Article 5 of the Outer Space Treaties, under which states shall immediately inform other states of any phenomena they discover in outer space which could constitute a danger to the life or health of astronauts. There are additional notification obligations foreseen by the Rescue Agreement, for instance, in cases of distress, emergency landings, unintended landings, or whenever states find space objects in their territory that have returned to Earth from space. You are also aware that there's another very central information sharing mechanism existing, which is the registration regime on the basis of United Nations space law. So the submission of registration information to the UN is a central obligation of launching states and the registering states, and you know that states are invited to submit information, for example, on the launching state or launching states, on the date and location of the launch, basic orbital parameters of the space object, and the general function of the space object. And Jean-François has also already introduced, of course, the Moon Agreement, and we shall not overlook the very specific and quite a high number of information exchange obligations that we have there, for instance, on the location and purposes of stations, or about any natural resources that states may discover on the Moon or other celestial bodies. If we do not only look at other information exchange mechanisms, but it's also nicely maybe to look, next slide please, on references that other provisions do go back to Article 11 of the Space Treaty. So can you show the next slide, please? We have direct references in space law instruments on Article 11, and there you find the remote sensing principles, for example, which recommend that states carrying out a program of remote sensing shall inform the UN about these programs on the basis of the registration regime, but also on the basis of Article 11 of the Space Treaty. The nuclear power sources principles refer directly to Article 11 of the Space Treaty. The nuclear power principles foresee a safety assessment with regard to nuclear power sources, and the results of such a safety assessment shall be reported to the United Nations and made available on the basis of Article 11. And then if you look a little bit further in the space law instruments, you find some indirect references on information exchange on space activities. For instance, the direct broadcasting principles require states or recommend that states share information on direct television broadcasting satellite activities, and that these be disseminated by the United Nations to specialized agencies, but also to the public and the international scientific community. And I also want to mention the Space Benefits Declaration, which really links the obligation of information exchange to the COPUOS mandate, and says that COPUOS should be strengthened in its role, amongst other, as a forum for the exchange of information on international and national space activities. And here we can recall the mandate of COPUOS, which goes back to a resolution by the General Assembly to 1959, which is the organization of the mutual exchange and dissemination of information on space research. So really, COPUOS seems to be at the center of implementation of Article 11 itself. But we will come to this in a minute. Please, let's see the next slide and turn to some instances of particular aspects of state practice in regard to Article 11 of the Outer Space Treaty. There are a couple of notifications that we find at the website from the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. You will find those note verbals or verbal notes that are submitted by states explicitly referencing to some provisions of the Outer Space Treaty, Article 5 that we mentioned, for example, but also on Article 11. And in preparation of this presentation here, I had a careful look at those notifications. Next slide, please. And I think the findings are really noteworthy. As far as my research went, there are really only two specific issues that states have submitted formal notifications under Article 11. And those are very specific issues where other instruments of space law specifically foresee notifications to the United Nations. We have discussed those references already in the previous slide. So I am, of course, speaking about information on space objects that look similar to registration information and information on the safety assessments in the context of nuclear power sources. We have those two cases here. The first part is information on space objects. There are approximately 45 notifications, mainly from the Netherlands and UK, and these states submit registration-related information on space objects with a reference to Article 11, where they do not consider themselves the registering state in accordance with Article 8 of the Outer Space Treaty and the registration conventions. There are very specific cases, and you're, of course, free to have a look at those notifications. And then there are 11 notifications which directly refer to Principle 4 of the nuclear power sources, which give information about safety assessments preceding the application of nuclear power sources. We have those notifications from a couple of states: Russia, the United States, and China. So I really have found no notification published at the website referencing Article 11, which cannot be assigned or allocated to one of these two categories, which I find quite interesting. Next slide, please. And these findings bring me to offer some food for thought to you, which could also be seen in preparation, of course, of next year's meeting of the working group on the citizen application of the 5 United Nations treaties. Next slide, please. I personally would really be interested in asking and really collecting together with delegations means of implementation of Article 11. I think it is safe to say that the formal notifications on Article 11 that I have just mentioned can be considered as means of implementation of Article 11. So states have made use of this means of verbal notes, but seemingly only in two cases or case families: information on space objects and information on the safety assessment of nuclear power sources. So one could say that this is very limited state practice, specifically concerning the implementation of Article 11. This leads us to the question whether registration itself is already regarded as a sufficient means to implement Article 11 of the Outer Space Treaty. So maybe phrased differently, is the furnishing of registration information on a space object to the United Nations a means to fulfill the obligation under Article 11 of the Outer Space Treaty, with a view to the space activity that this space object is pursuing? And if you turn to the next slide, please. This finding really is underlined by some previous documents of corpus. In 2022, there was the guidance document on the legal framework for space activities, elaborated by the working group under the chairmanship of Professor Schmidt, which really suggests this link. So it says that the registration regime contained in the Outer Space Treaty is intended to facilitate the exchange of information inter alia on the nature, conduct, and locations of space activities, in particular through the submissions by states of registration data to the Secretary General. And the working group, during the elaboration of this guidance document, did not reinvent something or came up with this finding just by themselves, but relied on previous work, especially on the work of the working group on national legislation relevant to the peaceful exploration and use of outer space. Their report in 2012, elaborated under the chairmanship or chairwomanship of Professor Mabo, resulted in a General Assembly resolution, which you probably also very well know, the recommendations on national legislation relevant to the peaceful exploration and use of outer space. And here again, this link is established between the provision of information under Article 11 to the greatest extent feasible and practical, and the registration of objects launched. So this is, I think, a really interesting link, which could lead to the question whether the furnishing of registration information on a space object can really be considered a means or even a sufficient means to fulfill the obligation under Article 11 of the Outer Space Treaty. Next slide, please. But if you follow this path, of course, registration information commonly does not include information, for example, on the results of space activities, as is foreseen by Article 11. So it might be useful to consider even additional means of implementation of Article 11. And I have listed some general ideas which could be considered means of implementation. I've talked about the mandate of corpus, and one central task is to facilitate information exchange. And of course, states do so by submitting reports and written and oral statements to corpus on their activities in general, but also on specific agenda items. Member states or state parties to the Outer Space Treaty, of course, also do release press statements and information on their space activities on websites, and they present their findings in international conferences and publications in scientific journals. Are all those activities, should these activities be considered means of implementation of Article 11? That would be, I think, an interesting question. And I would be really interested in learning the views of delegations, whether this is so. Also, I took note of the fact that there are a couple of international agreements on space cooperation, which also do refer to information exchange. So if ESA, for example, cooperates with another space agency, they most commonly have a provision on information sharing and dissemination of results of their space activity to the public. So this is also a means of implementation, or could be regarded as a means of implementation of Article 11, or at least preparing the implementation of Article 11. Next slide, please. And again, here, please consider this really as food for thought. When I look at Article 11, the term sleeping beauty comes to my mind, because I find that real specific state practice is really rare. And Mike, you also mentioned this before, that the office really seeks guidance on how states want to use this article, whether they want to use this article, and whether an increased use of this article can be anticipated, and how the office could disseminate information on Article 11 in a structured and effective way. And I think those topics that I've listed here could serve as a reason why we could see increased practice under Article 11. These areas of interest could be information exchange concerning activities on and the investigation of celestial bodies, going back to the moon and then to other celestial bodies. I think would be really crucial to exchange information on those activities. But of course, you can also look at the space space traffic in Earth orbits and beyond, and the need, which has been, of course, discussed also in other working groups of Corpus, that there is a need for enhanced information exchange on space objects and events, for example. And then if you look at the discussions that we have in Geneva on space security, for example, and the value of transparency and confidence building, but also enabling everyone around the globe, bridging the space divide to access the benefits of space for all, really has a link to this Article 11 and the international cooperation that needs to be strengthened for this purpose of Article 11 information sharing. With a view to the time, I'm happy to come to my last slide, please, which really offers some preliminary ideas for our possible discussion at the working group next year, based on these observations that I have just had the privilege to introduce to you. The idea would be really to remind delegations of the mandate that we have at the working group, and very, very cautiously suggest how we could structure a possible effective discussion. So these questions that you see here are really a proposal, and they are also work in progress on how member states and delegations could come prepared, and how we can tackle and commence this information exchange on the implementation of Article 11. It will be most interesting to hear the views of states, and of course the working group will do as states see is appropriate. But these questions that we've been preparing, I think it's maybe a good opportunity to introduce them here. And this would be: what is the scope of the obligation of Article 11? So really the key questions: what, how, and when to share, and what are adequate means of implementation. Then to what extent benefits the implementation of Article 11 the implementation of the UN instruments on international space law, something that Jean-Francois has also mentioned and Mike asked. So how does the implementation of Article 11 benefit the implementation, for example, of Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, and where is the link between those provisions? And then with a look a little bit into the future, how can implementation of Article 11 be strengthened and facilitated? Would it be useful to have a specific Article 11 information exchange mechanism? And if so, what type of information could be exchanged through such a specific mechanism in order to serve a purpose that is not already served by the existing registration information mechanism, for example? So these questions really are work in progress, and every comment and proposal would be very much welcome, and if I may say, even requested. So please, Mike, this turn to the next and last slide. In conclusion, I'm really pleased that there is consensus to start work on this topic at the working group, and I really look forward to seeing what delegations will bring to the table, and I stand ready to assist in any way that I can. And please do not hesitate to reach out and let me know what you think. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Francesca, and really congratulations on taking on this work and carrying the torch for this incredible working group. And like I said before, Jean-Francois was the helm of this. This working group has been around for almost 20 years. Around that time, Jean-Francois was also chair of this working group. Professor Schmidt-Ted, our good colleague as well, chair of this working group. And now you have this distinct opportunity to really drive this progressive development of international space law and our common understanding of what this treaty provision means and what are the possibilities for this. And this is, you outlined so clearly all the different areas where this is finds itself mentioned, and even indirectly under various other United Nations instruments. But This is also a provision that was mentioned in the Artemis Accords as well. So there is clearly a desire to flesh this out for the interests of states conducting space activities, conducting further activities in the exploration and use of outer space, so on all celestial bodies as well. This is something that, I mean, we're all desiring to hear more about what states really, what they want. And I'm so glad you've given some ideas about what may be useful in the deliberations. Do you have, if you could just share maybe an indication of where states seem to be in contemplating this? We have this CRP proposing this, and it found itself into the report to really raise this issue. What is your feeling on the state of play, let's say, in the discussion of this article? Thanks.
Thanks for the feedback and also the question, Mike. But I really cannot report too much because, of course, we were very busy last year or this year at the working group. We finished also some recommendations on the registration, interestingly also on the registration issue, on the registration of large satellite constellations. And so there was really limited time to discuss substance of Article 11. But this is also why I'm particularly grateful for this opportunity here to raise awareness that we have this agreement, that we want to discuss and start to discuss Article 11 during the meetings of the working group next year. And in order to really make the most of the time we have there, it would be really nice to come prepared and to structure the debate a little bit. And this is why I shared with you those preliminary questions, which we plan. I think I can say that here, which we also plan to distribute to COPUS delegations in advance of the legal subcommittee next year, to invite them and to propose those questions to them and invite them to come prepared to look at how they practice the implementation of Article 11, to maybe express some questions and where they want to take the work of the working group, maybe also with a view to a possible outcome. This is something we have not discussed at all. I really look forward to this ongoing work. And if there are any comments on preparation of the next meeting, I'm really happy to discuss.
Yes, that is excellent, and so glad to hear that there's good preparations being made and invitations to states to prepare themselves and provide information when the time comes. This is just a really great opportunity to flesh out this incredibly important article, and I again want to congratulate you for taking this on, and I know that the international community is in good hands with your stewardship in this important committee, this important working group. It's really excellent to have you. Thank you so much again for sharing your views, for coming and joining our conference and everything. This demonstrates how we are moving forward in the committee and in all of these discussions, and it shows really this current need to really flesh these things out. And in that regard, let's go ahead and turn to our final presenter of the day. Our good friend, Mr. Yu Shu from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China, to share some excellent words on Article 12, moon bases being open to all on the basis of reciprocity. So now we really look to the future for some inspiration about how we may tackle this incredible area as well. Let me go. Would you like me to share your presentation also, sir?
That would be very kind. Thank you.
Okay, let me just do so. Here we go. I believe can you see, is it being shared? Yes.
Yes, lovely. Thank you, Michael. Article 12 of Outer Space Treaty is the last topic for this year's UN Conference on Space Law and Policy, and I'm pleased to share my thoughts on this article. But before that, let me pose a question. Why we chose Article 12 to conclude the conference? If you're reading Outer Space Treaty carefully, you will find before the final clauses, there is Article 13, which addresses the role of international organizations in exploration and use of outer space. That article had been hotly debated in the treaty's negotiation and still warrants a close look today for its implementation. So why the organizer ignored it and closed the agenda with Article 12? What uniqueness of Article 12 he or she looked into? Unlike most articles of Outer Space Treaty, Article 12 cannot trace back to the UN General Assembly Resolution 1962. As an article of a treaty on principles, it carries an unusual strong hue of practicality. Furthermore, despite of rapid development in space science and technology, this article has yet to put to practice since its adoption. Next slide, please. So let's start with history. Comparing with other articles, the history of Article 12 is much clearer. It was United States initiative, and its original wording borrowed heavily from Antarctic Treaty of 1959. Draft Article 6 of United States proposal reads as follows. All areas of celestial bodies, including all stations, installations, equipment, and space vehicles on celestial bodies, shall be open at all times to representatives of other states conducting activities on celestial bodies. The U.S. representative believed that the notion of free and open access flowed naturally and logically from the prohibition of claims to territorial sovereignty, and stated that, I quote, "No state should be allowed to station on a celestial body any facility or device not open for observation by all." Other members of the legal subcommittee of Cupas were generally supportive, with the only exception of Soviet Union. Next slide, please. The Soviet Union's comments could be summarized as 2 points. Firstly, to delete all areas of celestial bodies, then to separate this article from the general principle of free access to outer space and celestial bodies. Secondly, to submit this right to conditions of reciprocity and prior agreement. The Soviet Union's comments provoked strong resistance from the United States and turned the discussions concerning this article into a quiet competition. West countries saw no need to repeat reciprocity, and the whole treaty was one of reciprocal rights and obligations. Furthermore, they read prior agreement as an implied veto power to free access. On the opposite side, the Eastern Bloc countries argued that facilities open at all times were practically impossible, and at once agreement on date of visit would avoid harmful interference to the facilities and ensure the safety of the personnel. To narrow the gap between the two sides, Italy and Japan offered amendments which introduced safety considerations and maximum precaution to the text of this article. Although helpful, those efforts failed to bridge the gap, and the legal subcommittee could not agree on the draft after meeting for 4 weeks in Geneva. Next slide, please. After the legal subcommittee reconvened in New York in September 1966, United States submitted a revised proposal which, drawing on constructive proposals made by Italy and Japan, deleted the phases of all areas of celestial bodies at all times and add elements of reasonable advance notice, appropriate consultation, and on a basis of reciprocity. Such a text successfully resolved the concerns voiced by Soviet Union and became Article 12 of Outer Space Treaty, which was lately adopted by the General Assembly. So looking back to the history of Article 12, what guidance it provides us. So next slide, please. To my mind, at least three takeaways. First, there are multiple ways to approach this article. In addition to non-appropriation, principles such as free access, international cooperation, peaceful use of outer space, and information sharing were also referred to by member states in the negotiation process, which shows a great potential of this article in promoting rule of law in outer space. Secondly, the negotiation reaffirms the only way to fill gaps is building trust through information sharing and cooperation. Lastly, no matter how carefully crafted, an article cannot solve all issues identified and must be fine-tuned through subsequent practices. Next slide, please. Before elaborating further those takeaways, let's briefly turn to the text of Article 12, which is the very basis for any follow-up interpretation and application. The first sentence of Article 12 lays out a general principle, namely, all stations, installations, equipments, and space vehicles on the Moon and other celestial bodies shall be open to representatives of other state parties to the treaty on a basis of reciprocity. Although drafted in obligatory way, free access as a right is not condition-free. Besides those requirements indicated in the second sentence, reciprocity as basis for such right has to be established before carrying out any visit. As far as public international law is concerned, reciprocity means a state claiming a right has to accord the same right to other states. However, such a well-established principle of law has to adapt in its application to outer space. In particular, a one-sided version of reciprocity was invented by United States representative as precondition for its final compromise. Namely, a state should have the right of access to stations of another state, regardless of whether the second state had ever claimed or exercised a right of access itself. Only if the first state had denied access to the second state, then the latter was not required to grant access to the first state. Subsequent academic publications generally reaffirmed such interpretation, but how to put it in practice, verifying whether reciprocity is fulfilled without prior access, is still hanging there for upcoming lunar facility operators. So next slide, please. The second sentence of Article 12 provides how to exercise a reciprocal right of access, which mainly covers three steps: advance notice, thereafter consultation for the visit, and precaution measures during the visit. Due to time constraint, I would not dwell on each steps, but flag an entry point for further study. As a matter of fact, visit to stations on celestial bodies constitutes a space activity, which should be governed by general principles such as peaceful use, international cooperation, and due regard. The terms used in this sentence, such as consultation, notice, and interference, also appear across texts of the treaty, which logically invite other articles of the treaty into play. To compound the difficulties of its application, the three steps are requirements of action rather than requirement of result. Whether at how to fulfill those requirements as a context-sensitive matter leaves freely and fully to the parties concerned. Allow me to deviate a little and comment on the creative idea to establish jurisdiction and control over facilities by repurposing Article 12. As a matter of fact, besides stations and installations, Article 12 also applies to space vehicles and equipments, which in most cases are space objects launched and registered by appropriate states. Those states therefore retain full jurisdiction and control over them under Article 8. Therefore, I do not want any innovative interpretation of Article 12 to disturb the proper functioning of Article 8 and to subject their jurisdiction and control to conditions of reciprocity as well as those procedure arrangement. Secondly, to respectfully disagree with militia who argue strongly for certain rights implied by denial of right of access. I would like to argue that successful exercise of right of access or visit would equally, if not in a higher order, establish certain host rights. And lastly, I would sound a note of caution about too many and too much implications when dealing with the treaty interpretation, which might risk falling far away from the letter and spirit of the treaty. Ideally, articles of Outer Space Treaty, including Article 12, should function as a harmonious and tidy whole. Each and every articles dovetail well, reinforce each other, and deliver synergy and effectiveness. In reality, friction and discord are quite common in interpreting and applying treaty provisions. To iron out all those differences, we have to put the treaty into practice. Next slide, please. So the letter of Article 12 remained unchanged in the past 57 years. It is hard to see its spirit and intent remains so today. As the International Law Commission of the United Nations rightly pointed out in its recent work, that subsequent agreements can provide an authentic means of and have impact on the interpretation of treaties. Whether that phenomena happens to Article 12 of Outer Space Treaty, and if so, what is the effect of subsequent agreements upon its meaning, is a subject matter for serious academic study. To simply provide some food for thought, I would like to refer to Article 15, paragraph 1 of the Moon Agreement, which was adopted in 1979. This paragraph reads as follows. Each state party may assure itself that the activity of other state parties in the exploration and use of the Moon are compatible with the provisions of this agreement. To this end, all space vehicles, equipment, facilities, stations, and installations on the Moon shall be open to other state parties. not only sports a glaring omission on reciprocity, this provision also narrowed the purpose of a right of access to monitoring the implementation of provisions of the Moon Agreement. Can the Moon Agreement be regarded as the subsequent agreements for the purpose of interpretation of Article 12 of Outer Space Treaty? Indeed, Article 12 is increasingly considered as a transparency and confidence building measure, TCBM. Is it a ripple effect of the Moon Agreement? So next slide. Besides subsequent agreements, state practices as a supplementary means are also important for the purpose of interpretation and application of treaties. State practice can take various forms, involve executive, legislative, judicial, or other public functions, and not necessarily limited to operational activities. In that sense, we cannot take it for granted that no visit to stations on celestial bodies means no state practice so far pertaining to Article 12. A survey across member states on national space law and regulations would better prepare us to ascertain whether those key terms used in this article are capable of evolving over time, therefore adaptive to new space activities in the next decade. Another point which somehow easily forgotten is that Article 12 only applies to the Moon and other celestial bodies, not the outer space, as most provisions of Outer Space Treaty do. The underlying reason for that is unknown. The most convincing one I can think of is a careless vestige of the US draft, whose scope of application is limited to the Moon and other celestial bodies. Although the whole treaty, as well as its most provisions, adopt the Soviet Union's approach and expanded to the outer space, Article 12 got overlooked and slipped through the net. Interestingly, the representative of India did raise this issue at the legal subcommittee meeting, saying, I quote, "It might perhaps be desirable to refer in that article to outer space as well as to celestial bodies, since platform might be constructed in space." Unfortunately, Indians' wise advice unheeded. So today we are not in a position to second-guess or venture modifying Article 12 by subsequent practices. From a practical perspective, International Space Station, China Space Station, and other projected space stations do provide valuable opportunities to exercise the right of access. To what extent rules applicable to visit to space stations would differ from those of visit to the moon stations is another open question with profound consequences. The real opportunity arises with unfolding of Artemis missions and International Lunar Research Station program. Among the gateways, starships, ILRS, and the auxiliary facilities would come out a first facility visitable for representatives of other state parties. A successful trailblazer visit, if that happens, would send a strong symbolic signal to ongoing lunar missions and unleash untapped potential of Article 12 for international cooperation. However, along with every opportunity comes risks and challenges. Article 12 alone cannot provide solutions to all those challenges, and legal reasoning as a rule-based exercise must at the same time be politically informed. So the last slide. So the moon and other celestial bodies and outer space in large, though far away, are never detached from the Earth. During the negotiation of the Outer Space Treaty, many representatives of member states sincerely believe that a ban on arms race in outer space would trigger a breakthrough of arms control on the Earth. On the historical importance of Outer Space Treaty, the United States Representative Ambassador Goldenberg famously said, I quote, "Extending the rule of law to outer space at a time when man would soon be able to land on the moon was a pressing one. As now we are at a time when women and men would soon be able to return to the moon. A new pressing task for us is to revisit Outer Space Treaty, including its Article 12, with a view of reflecting present realities and further at the future prospects. Rule of law has been successfully extended to outer space by our forerunners. It is now for us to pass the torch on to the generation of the future." With that, I conclude my presentation, and if time permits, I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your kind words and presentation there. And it really is inspiring that you have the optimism, of course, to recognize this rule of law and this basis that that states can really work together in outer space, which is really core in the Outer Space Treaty. And specifically under Article 12, you know, this forward-looking opportunity that states potentially can coordinate their activities and potentially even work together on the moon, and have this way of actually implementing this treaty provision, noting that, of course, we have states who are working together in different capacities, in different ways, all looking to go to the same place, really. And this, of course, you mentioned this opportunity for this with the Artemis missions, and also with the International Lunar Research Station and your partners, along with the Russian Federation as well. And in fact, it was this kind of optimism and this kind of forward-looking opportunity that I wanted to leave this conference in a way, instead of, well, with Article 13, as you pointed out, it's a bit pedestrian for our considerations, where it's more of a joint and several liability kind of article regarding states and their involvement in intergovernmental organization, international organizations involved in outer space activities, which we, of course, are quite well aware of how those work out, and finds themselves in other treaty provisions as well, and in other parts of space law, and also the way we organize our work all over the globe in space activities. And maybe if I could just ask you to elaborate maybe on this aspect that I think you brought up, but I think maybe needs a little bit more fleshing out in terms of what we've been discussing today. Now, maybe can you give us your thoughts on what kind of content and scope of information that could be shared, say, under Article 11, that could then provide the basis for an organization of reciprocal visits to stations on the moon? How could this information sharing provide this opportunity to facilitate the coordination of such visits? And then how could this also play into the verification that such stations on the moon are there for peaceful purposes, a verification method as well? Because I think that is, we were talking about a number of things yesterday, even in the security context, which is something we don't normally do in the peaceful uses, but this also offers an opportunity to demonstrate the peaceful uses and the peaceful character of stations located on the moon. Can you share your thoughts on information sharing in that respect? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for all those kind words. Yes, on the information sharing, I fully agree that Article 11 of Outer Space Treaty is quite relevant. It's maybe the leading provisions to strengthen information sharing. But at the same time, I think Article 12 also implies that certain information sharing should be a precondition if you want to carry out a visit to a station on the moon. With that, I want to refer to the practices on the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. They have very well-developed documentation on how to operationalize the user term inspections to the stations. They have a checklist of those informations. Different kind of stations will have their own information requirement. So although I fully agree with Professor Freeland that the space is different, but we still can learn and refer to those practices which is already carried out several times on the Antarctic Treaty frameworks. My emphasis is on the information sharing under Article 12 should be should be able to action upon, because there will be operationalized a visit. This is not only for the purpose of information sharing. You have to rely on those information to plan your visit, to decide how to design the precaution measures, how intrusive your visit can be, and what timing should be convenient for both sides. I think that it is more I use word hands-on information, which might be different from the Article 11, which is more general. You mentioned the TCBM information, but for me, look to the future. I want to develop into a presumption of reciprocity, rather than you have to verify whether you have the reciprocity or not. Because you look to the US proposed interpretation, is already a development from the classic reciprocity requirements. You have a default understanding that if there's no evidence argue against your presumption, you should take it for granted that there's reciprocity between those member states who have their own stations on the moon. I will stop here because I think that although the values and the benefits of Article 11 should be highlighted, but at the same time, I still want to keep it open that you can share information on the different articles as long as I said, complement each other, reinforce each other, and benefit each other of those articles.
Oh, absolutely. And I thank you for that perspective. And I really like this approach of this presumption of reciprocity, that this way of looking at it is a very positive way and very harmonious way. And I want to also thank you and the government of China as well, and your work in actually implementing these articles of the treaty in a very new and novel way. Of course, we saw this with this information sharing under Article 5 as well recently, which was very highly discussed in our community. And I think it's really this demonstrates this living nature, as you pointed out, of this treaty, of how states need to use these provisions for their purposes. And this, you rightly point out that this Article 12 is a very much, is going to be used at the time when it is most necessary, let's say, when the stations are in place. And this background of information from Article 11 can only feed that later information regarding the specific request. And I also would really like to thank you again for mentioning and highlighting the Antarctic Treaty and that regime as giving us possible understanding and guidance about how we may fulfill these kinds of requirements of notification, of information, of the scope, and how deep we are looking into things, and the temporal aspects as well. I think that we should also, and this is what was brought up by Jean-Francois as well, was to look to these other areas that we have developed so well and to understand, are they applicable in this context of further exploration of the moon and other celestial bodies? Can we use these already well-trodden paths to help us forge our way into the future, is what I'm trying to say. And I really want to thank you for also highlighting that and providing the views of your government as well. It really is so important that we share all of these things. And I just am so happy that you were there to wrap up our entire conference of this substantive material, of making all of these presentations. It really means a lot to me, and it means a lot to our community as well. Thank you again, sir. Well, with that, I just say that we have now reached the end of our presentations for today, the end of our substance of examining Articles 1 through 12 of the Outer Space Treaty. We have been on an incredible ride. We have seen the history of space activities throughout time. We have seen our current state of play and where the international community is heading, and where we're thinking about considering ways in which we can use the Outer Space Treaty, and also in these future aspects really giving us some inspiration and hope that we can continue to cooperate in all of these areas as well. With that, I would like to maybe, I feel like I can just move right into our final discussion. I will go ahead and make some comments on the observations and conclusions of the conference today, these last few days. Let me go ahead and I can share my screen and I can run through these with you. If you will allow me, I really would appreciate it. Thank you so much. So we begin our understanding in our conference on the United Nations Conference on Space Law and Policy and the Outer Space Treaty of the 21st Century. How do we really how do we understand where we've been and where we're going? And these are just some observations and conclusions I was considering that may be relevant for you to take with you, dear participants. Thank you. So I will just read some out. The United Nations Conference on Space Law and Policy, Outer Space Treaty for the 21st Century, focused on current and future space activities under the framework of fundamental principles of international space law found in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. The conference offered a forum to express a wide range of globally diverse views from government, practitioners, academia, the private sector, and explored numerous facets of global governance of outer space activities, multilateral approaches to addressing matters of common concern, and mechanisms for cooperation and collaboration in space activities. The conference recognized the continuing relevance and applicability of the fundamental principles of outer space, even more than 50 years now since they were first enshrined in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. Approaches to implement those principles have ranged from formal treaty making in the early days, the adoption of principles, and now to current modern voluntary instruments, all of which track the progressive development of space law to support the needs of states and the private sector in engaging in space activities. COPUS and its legal subcommittee and scientific and technical subcommittee remain instrumental in providing the primary international forum for strengthening governance and promoting cooperation in outer space activities. The multilateral approach to solving global problems in space will remain essential in addressing emerging issues such as the rapid recent growth of orbital activities and the future exploration of the moon and other celestial bodies. Information sharing is a core enabler of international cooperation and mechanisms to share and disseminate information from states on their activities in outer space found in the provisions of the Outer Space Treaty, and it can facilitate the development of new approaches to coordinate the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space. The international space community is encouraged to work together on finding suitable solutions to common challenges. The safety of space operations, space traffic management, and the utilization of space resources are examples of novel areas where multilateral discussions are currently being undertaken and where new approaches that promote the sharing of information and international coordination are considered. These new approaches offer further opportunities for all states to contribute to the global governance of outer space activities and the progressive development of space law. As space becomes more accessible to new actors, the fundamental principles in the Outer Space Treaty that states are under an obligation to provide authorization and continuing supervision for the activities of their non-governmental entities is more important now than ever before. In this regard, states are encouraged to continue to develop robust national regulatory frameworks to fulfill their treaty obligations. The implementation of international space law into the national regulatory frameworks allows states to promote the space economy and use their national commercial space programs in order to gain the benefits of space science and technology for their citizens, which underscores the fundamental principle recognized at the dawn of the space age that space activities were to the benefit of all humanity. Building the capacity of space states in space science and technology is key to make the most out of what space has to offer. Robust space laws and policies at the national level that are rooted in the fundamental principles found in the Outer Space Treaty can facilitate the building and strengthening of a state's capacity to engage in space activities and help build national commercial capacity to commercial and national capacity to safely and sustainably operate space assets. These observations I hope to include in our report on this conference, which will be made available to the legal subcommittee in all official languages of the United Nations. And I will also provide a link to that when it becomes available on the website of the office and on the page for the conference as well. And also to remind folks that I will be posting all of the presentations and all the proceedings and the recordings and answers to these very interesting questions in the chat that I was not able to get to in these last few days. It's really been an incredible discussion I've seen gone on there. And I really thank you for your active participation in all of these matters. This has been an amazing conference. I feel like I can now make my concluding remarks and we can wrap this up finally, maybe a little bit early, but recognizing that the content and the quality of our speakers and presentations almost necessitated further consideration and discussion. I could not hold myself back in these last days, actually. I really appreciate everybody's contribution. So I will just make a few concluding remarks. On behalf of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, it has been my honor to organize and moderate this fifth session of the United Nations Conference on Space Law and Policy on the theme, The Outer Space Treaty for the 21st Century. I would particularly like to thank the speakers and presenters on each topic who have given their time to be with us today and share their expertise in these areas. And it is due to their valuable contributions that the most has been made out of this conference for sure. We have focused these last 3 days on the treaty and principles governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space, what we all refer to as the Outer Space Treaty, which entered into force in 1967, as mentioned many times. We have seen how the fundamental principles found in this treaty remain the essential legal framework for states conducting activities in outer space to this day. This underscores the importance recognized by the General Assembly of international cooperation for developing international law, including international space law, which has been essential to ensure the exploration and use of outer space remains for peaceful purposes. Key enablers of international cooperation are binding and non-binding instruments that govern the use and exploration of outer space. In this regard, it has been the guiding light for states in progressively developing international space law, the Outer Space Treaty has, and in the principles that have been elaborated over the years into numerous binding and non-binding agreements, as well as into principles and resolutions and guidelines that have been so mentioned by many presenters. These have met the ever-evolving, changing needs posed by increasing exploration and use of outer space, the needs of states and the needs of the private sector to engage in those activities. We have discussed emerging issues in space law and policy stemming from these new activities. It will likely require new approaches beyond the creation of traditional legal instruments. At their core, these new approaches recognize and build on the dynamic relationship between space actors spanning the spectrum from government to private industry, and offer unique opportunities to tackle these different and difficult issues in space. At this time, taking advantage of these emerging opportunities for cooperation among states demonstrates a shared commitment of the international community to maintaining space for peaceful purposes, promoting development, and fostering international cooperation in the development of space law. We have met the objective for this conference, which have been to promote awareness and knowledge of the legal and policy aspects and implications, both current and anticipated, for our activities in outer space. Second, we have drawn attention to the authorities and decision makers to issues of the progressive development of international space law. Third, we have increased public awareness and of the increasing and possible challenges and threats to areas in outer space activities. And finally, fourthly, we have promoted international cooperation in space-related areas that require a multilateral approach and a shared sense of commitment and responsibility to the peaceful and sustainable use of outer space for all. And distinguished participants, with that, I would like to thank you once again for spending time with us over these last 3 days and allowing me to share some of my views on these matters and hearing out our distinguished presenters on these as well. It has been our pleasure. Finally, I would like to thank also the presenters and speakers once again who have shared their vast experience and expertise and their learned views on these matters so that we may better understand the past, present, and future of space activities in the context of the Outer Space Treaty. Thank you all again for joining us in the United Nations Conference on Space Law and Policy, and for making it a resounding success. Thank you again. With that, I would like to bid you all farewell, and that we hope to have another conference on space law and policy next year, and to be looking forward to that as well. We hope to see you all there again. Thank you again to everyone. I really appreciate it. This has been a wonderful experience for me personally, and I'm honored to do this for the international community as well. Thank you, and have a good day, morning, or evening, wherever you are.